Well, welcome everyone. My name is Phil Huber. I'm a fellow classmate of Jonathan Alter and Frank Lavin. It's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan and Frank, who will conduct a most interesting conversation about Jonathan's new biography of Jimmy Carter. They'll also discuss their long friendship and late night debates in Paul Revere Hall. Frank has had a most interesting career in politics, international relations, and business. Frank served in the Reagan administration, was an Undersecretary of Commerce, and ambassador to Singapore. He is currently CEO of Export Now, a company dedicated to helping consumer brands sell their products in China. We've all seen Jonathan regularly on TV as a political analyst. Jonathan is also an award-winning author, documentary filmmaker, columnist, television producer, and radio host. Jonathan's documentary, Breslin and Hamill, Deadline Artists, won the Emmy this fall for Best Historical Documentary. And the Carter biography is Jonathan's fourth book. Congratulations. Jonathan and Frank, we are all really excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks so much. And thank you to the audience here. I just was reviewing the list a minute ago of signups, and it's very encouraging to see so many class of 75 folks on board, our contemporaries, and also the adjacent classes. And I think I'd like to flatter myself, John, that it's folks with fond memories of us, which I hope drives some of the participation, but it's also the contemporaneous moment for the book you wrote. But these are people for whom the Carter administration is in living memory, and they have potentially personal experiences or interaction with it as well. So it's a delight, I think, both on a personal level to say hello to our friends and classmates and associates and siblings and parents and current students of the Academy. And it's a special delight to say hi to John, that the pandemic has kept me from seeing in the past year or so, but remember well. So I ask everybody on this webinar, you're going to travel back in time with us to Paul Revere South, 1975, and we're going to hear a fervent defense of the Carter campaign and the Carter presidency from, I assume, the world's leading expert of the Carter administration. But John, why don't you, I think it'd be great to start by just giving us an overview of your book and your findings and what the Carter administration meant. So we'd love to hear from you. The floor is yours, John.
Well, thanks, Frank, and thank you, Phil, for moderating this, and thanks to Andover for setting it up, and all of you who probably have better things to do. But I'm really glad that you joined tonight and wanted to listen to this. It really does take me back to Paul Revere South. I came as an upper, so I was there for 2 years, 73, 74. 74, 75. Ed and Ruth Quattlebaum were Frank and my housemasters. I guess you can't use that word master anymore, but they were fantastic, and we had a great dorm. But there was some, I would call it, productive political tension between me and Frank. Frank is an Ohio-born Republican. I'm not sure your whole family is Republican. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of remember that at least your sister and I think Carl were Democrats. But you, from a very early age, were a Republican. And I was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. In the years since, I have occasionally voted for Republican candidates. I'm not a far left Democrat, but my mother was the first woman elected in Cook County to public office as a Democrat. And the city of Chicago is heavily Democratic, and they were reform, sort of anti-Mayor Daley Democrats. So that's the world I grew up in. And I knew very few Republicans growing up, and certainly none anywhere close to being as smart as Frank. So when I showed up at Paul Revere full of my liberal cant and received opinions about the way the world works, I ran into a buzzsaw who, if I remember right, had double 800s on his SATs. And I found myself having to improve my arguments as they were tested by Frank. And we really went at it. But ultimately, there were no hard feelings. And when Frank was in the Reagan White House, I believe you were cabinet secretary at a certain point, right? I would go and visit you, and Frank would occasionally write me notes on White House stationery, taking little jabs at my politics, which I appreciated and thought was amusing. So that's the context of this conversation. I had written 3 prior books, also about Democratic presidents, one on Franklin Roosevelt and his first 100 days as president, which I just got a boost on. The book came out in 2006, but I just got a boost because Joe Biden said that he was reading it on Brene Brown's podcast. So, ka-ching on that for me right now. It happened earlier when Obama, after he was elected, also at a time of economic dislocation. So, that was how I started in book writing, was writing about Roosevelt at a time of crisis. Then I wrote 2 books about Obama, and I was looking to do my next book 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago. And I saw Jimmy Carter at a book club event in New York, and somebody knew his grandson, Jason, and they brought Jimmy Carter. I had only met him a couple of times. I had been an intern in his speechwriting office in the summer of 1978 when I was in college. But I hadn't really paid much attention to him. And I had actually been for Ted Kennedy in 1980, which was a huge mistake in retrospect. It was ridiculous for Kennedy to have challenged Carter for the nomination. But that evening at our book group in 2015, when Carter started talking about Camp David, we were reading a book by Lawrence Wright of the New Yorker about Camp David. And this was just a virtuoso performance. The Camp David Accords are the most significant and durable peace treaty since World War II. And the idea that somebody who could accomplish that, and then he also talked that night about his human rights policy, which was somewhat hypocritical, but it did a lot, according to conservatives in later years, to lead to the end of the Cold War. People like Václav Havel thought it was very important, Soviet dissidents. And it also helped kick off the democratization of Latin America and parts of Asia. So I started to think, as I was listening to Carter that evening, there has to be more to this guy than inept president inspiring former president. It's just got to be more complicated than that. And then when I mentioned this to my editor, the late Alice Mayhew at Simon & Schuster, who is also Jimmy Carter's editor, she got really excited about, putting 2 of her authors together, basically, and she smoothed the way. So when I learned that I would get a lot of access and be able to spend a lot of time with both Carters and their family, I realized I had a kind of a pretty unique opportunity. And then when I found out that there had never been a full-length biography of Jimmy Carter before, and there have been 9 of Ted Kennedy, for instance, and hundreds of JFK and at least a dozen of Ronald Reagan, I realized this guy has been kind of neglected, and that I really had an opportunity and a lot of running room to do this book. So about 5.5 years ago, I set to work on it.
That's a great story. Can you sum up the Carter presidency and why? I don't think it's unfair to say, John, that he's probably viewed as unsuccessful or as a failure. Some of that might just be the verdict of history, in fact, that all one-term presidents suffer from saying, well, you were rejected, so something went wrong, you were thrown out. So he's in that pool, and that might be arbitrary, might be unfair, but nonetheless, he has that stigma. And I think you're right. You kind of summed up probably the popular perception of a guy who spent his life very humbly working in charitable projects post presidency, uh, in a very staid personality, no scandals, no personal foibles. But the presidency itself fell short of the mark, fell short of the promise that he came in with. Is that how accurate or inaccurate is that, or how would you describe the presidency?
Well, there's no question that it fell short of its promise. And, I have a whole section of the book that's entitled Swamped. He was swamped by events in the last 2 years of his presidency. I describe him as a political failure and a substantive and often far-sighted success. So, as a journalist, and I didn't really cover him as president. Reagan was the first president that I covered for Newsweek. But journalists assess presidents by how they do politically. If you're not successful politically, you're going to be thought of as falling short. Historians have a little bit of a different responsibility, and we need to look at how did this president change the country, whatever his political failings. So another one-term president recently, George H.W. Bush, I think is rightly now getting some credit for things like the peaceful winding down of the Cold War, the peaceful reunification of Germany. Things that at the time, you didn't know how long the peace was going to last. So you weren't sure how much credit do I give George Bush for the fact. My feeling is a lot, because normally when empires collapse, they do so violently. And in this case, the Soviet Empire collapsed without violence. And I give Bush a lot of credit for that. But you need the perspective of history to understand that. And I think the same thing applies to Jimmy Carter. So, it was hard to give him that much credit for Camp David when Camp David actually fell apart immediately after they came back from Camp David. And 6 months later, Carter had to go to the region and put the whole thing back together with chewing gum and, duct tape. And so to give him too many props for it at that point wouldn't have made sense, because who knows, maybe next year, maybe by, 6 months after that, the thing would fall apart again. So but now it's lasted for 42 years. So, and there hasn't been a shot fired in anger between Israel and Egypt. And the Egyptian army was the only army capable of driving Israel into the sea and destroying the state of Israel. So among the sort of more novel things I came to was that even though Jimmy Carter is very pro-Palestinian in many ways, that deeds are more important than words, and that he was actually the best president for the security of the state of Israel since Harry Truman, another president who was very unpopular when he was president and immediately afterward. And it wasn't for about 30 years. David McCullough wrote a book kind of resurrecting Truman. By the way, Carter put Truman's the sign he had on his desk, "The buck stops here." Carter put that on his desk, and he was a very accountable president. Although, just one other quick thing, he was not humble. I think a humble politician is kind of a contradiction in terms. He was and is modest, and so that that modesty is authentic. At the time, I think people weren't sure. He's carrying his own bags. He's sleeping in the homes of supporters. He's depumping the presidency. That all came from, he's cheap in certain ways, but he also does not put on airs. That is not part of who he is. And in that sense, and given his many contributions as a former president, there's something inspirational there in our time about a decent and honest, truth-telling president.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment, John. He's a completely unpretentious guy. I had a chance to meet him just a few times, but he's a very accessible person. But what struck me in my meetings with him is he's not a naturally warm person or a natural extrovert. And there's no rough edges. There's nothing off-putting about him, but you end up talking to a bit and you come to the conclusion he's a very bright guy. He's on top of his game, but he doesn't connect readily with other people, and you almost wonder that he'd almost be better as a cabinet secretary or as chief of staff to a president than as an actual president. And you wonder, why did a guy like that choose elective office? Because he's not a hail fellow well met kind of fellow. So did you get that kind of impression on his
Yeah.
personality?
Everything you say is true, except I would argue that he's multi-layered. He is so. Franklin Roosevelt, shortly after he was inaugurated, he went over to a birthday party for Oliver Wendell Holmes' 92nd birthday. And after Roosevelt left, Holmes famously said, second class intellect, first class temperament. And I think Jimmy Carter has a first class intellect. He's one of the smartest people who's ever been president of the United States. And he's actually a Renaissance man, which we can get into. And he has many skills. But his temperament, as you say, so Carter is the inverse, first class intellect, second class temperament. His emotional intelligence is not on par with that of some politicians who lack his IQ. And so I think what you say is accurate in this sense. So Carter is an engineer, and I have a whole chapter called His Inner Engineer. And you look at corporate America, often the engineers fall just short of being CEO. They're smarter than the CEO. They're better problem solvers than the CEO, but they're not really leaders like CEOs become. And in part because engineers come to the right answer, and they think if you get the right answer, why doesn't everybody else understand this is the right answer? And so they go charging up the hill with their answer, and they look behind and there's no one behind them. And so Carter was this strange and, to me, absolutely fascinating combination of he was essentially a visionary without being a natural leader. And that's a tough combination. But I think because people don't understand the visionary part of it, not just that he put solar panels on the roof of the White House, which Reagan took down, but on many areas, he did things that in some cases Reagan got credit for. Like he appointed Paul Volcker, who ended inflation. Reagan got the credit for that. He built the B-2 bomber, which was the most effective weapon in winning the Cold War. Reagan got credit for the weapons the Carter Pentagon built. He introduced intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe. Reagan got the credit. So even if you're looking at it from a hawkish direction, there are all these sort of forward-looking things that Carter did. But if you're looking at it from a more liberal perspective, he was a true visionary on the environment. He signed 14 major pieces of environmental legislation, and he doubled the size of the National Park Service with the Alaska Lands deal, and he was the first leader anywhere in the world who recognized that climate change was a problem that the government was going to have to deal with. But it comes out of this, in some ways, the presidency was only part of what I found so compelling about this guy. He has led an epic American life, and his story is like something out of a novel. If you take it from being raised on a farm with no running water, no electricity, barefoot most of the year, not poor, but living in a feudal system, one step up from slavery. And so I define him as basically the only president who was effectively born, who effectively lived in 3 centuries. He was born in 1924, but it might as well have been the 19th century. And he was not just president, but connected to all the big movements of the 20th century. And he, for instance, appointed more women to the federal bench than all of his predecessors combined times 5. He basically took the federal government from tokenism to diversity, and was connected to, obviously the civil rights movement, although he was ducking that movement in the Jim Crow South. But so he's very much in the 20th century. And now in the 21st century, what does the Carter Center do? It does global health, democracy promotion, conflict resolution, all the cutting edge issues of the 21st century. So this is an American, not just an American journey, almost like a pilgrimage of a life, but a life where he was deeply connected to his times over a now 96-year period.
John, we've got one question. I've got a few comments, but I've got one question here. Look, I just, to one comment on point you made, I had a grad school prof who, per your comment on Carter's foreign policy, said the Reagan doctrine actually began around the summer, spring of 1979, funding the Afghan rebels and a policy of saying we're going to get involved with third parties to push back against the Soviets. That was an evolution of Carter. Reagan obviously took it further than Carter, but Carter lit that fuse. So that was a very interesting point. I want to go to Chris. Chris Doherty asks a question. I'll just to enter time read it to you.
Hi, Chris.
John, do you think Carter would have been reelected absent the Ted Kennedy, Jerry Brown challenges? Maybe the Rose Garden strategy would have worked vis-a-vis the GOP. And what might Carter's legacy have been in a second term?
So first, I want to just add something to what you just said that was very interesting about the Reagan doctrine. Same thing applies to human rights. I interviewed Elliot Abrams, who was Reagan's Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, and they actually continued. There was a little hiccup, but eventually they continued the human rights policy and moved away from Jeane Kirkpatrick's view, and then George W. Bush, made democracy promotion the very centerpiece of his foreign policy was human rights. In answer to Chris's question, I think the causes of Carter's defeat are many, and it's true that he went up in the polls after, he's way behind Kennedy in the fall of 1979. And then on November 4th, 1979, two really important things happened. It's also exactly 1 year to the day before the 1980 presidential election. But the hostages are seized in Iran, in part because Carter made the mistake of letting the Shah of Iran into the United States for medical treatment. The Rockefellers and Kissinger and others pulled the wool over Carter's eyes and made it seem as if the Shah could not be treated in Mexico. And Carter had been very suspicious of the idea of letting the Shah in. And at one point, months earlier, it actually said, "Fuck the Shah." You wouldn't think that Carter would say that, but he did. And then he lets him in and the hostages are seized. So he can't get them out before the election. So this is obviously a huge reason why he seemed impotent and lost the election. They tried the hostage rescue mission in April of 1980 and it failed. The second big reason, I think, was the economy. So I mentioned Paul Volcker. In order to end inflation, Volcker jacked up interest rates over 15%. It's pretty hard to run for re-election when you have interest rates over 15, even close to 20%, inflation still in double digits. So Volcker's medicine didn't work until Reagan became president. And I asked Volcker not long before he died, some people say that, you elected and re-elected Ronald Reagan. And he said, I guess people have said that. And then he told me a story about how he was on a big fishing trip, and Carter was on this trip too. There were a number of people there. And he went up to Carter, who he says he greatly admired. And he said, "I'm sorry if I cost you the presidency." And Carter said, "Don't worry about it, Paul. There were many factors." So, it was the hostages, the economy, and then the third factor I would say is what Chris brought up, which is that it's really hard to run for president when your party is divided. And it wasn't a problem that Kennedy challenged him because he was so far ahead in the polls. Even Carter's people said, of course he's going to run. But then when he fell in the polls, and I should have mentioned the other thing that happened on November 4th, 1979, was that Kennedy gave an interview to Roger Mudd of CBS in which he couldn't answer the question, why do you want to be president? And his campaign just cratered. And everybody rallied around the flag with the Rose Garden strategy that Chris described, and Carter went way up in the polls. He cruised through the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary. And if at that point, if Kennedy had gotten out and said, look, I lost this president, I might not like him that much. They didn't like each other personally, which is a big story, but I'm going to unite the party. Instead, he fights it all the way to the convention. And that was very harmful to Carter. And when I asked Carter what his biggest mistake was, he said that he didn't manage relations within the Democratic Party well enough. So whatever you say about Trump, and I say a lot of harsh stuff about him, he did have a unified Republican Party, and Carter did not. And the fourth factor was just that, your old boss, Ronald Reagan, he just turned out to be as George Will described him, a thoroughbred candidate. And the contrast as communicators was really stark. And that's what turned, I think, a close race. It was very close until the end. Then they had that one debate, and which Reagan won pretty easily. He says, there you go again, and are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And that turned a kind of a close race into a landslide.
Yeah. Good. Any comments on what a second term might have been, or what?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't think about that. So when I talked to Carter about this, and I interviewed him more than a dozen times for the book, he said that his big hope for a second term, besides hoping that Volcker's medicine would work, which it did in Reagan's first term. So besides having the economy come back, was to complete the unfinished business of Camp David. Camp David was two things. It was peace between Israel and Egypt, and then it was a foundation for autonomy and eventually a Palestinian state, a comprehensive Middle East settlement. And that didn't happen, and it still hasn't happened. So he was going to focus on that. But then, and as well as many other things, because he was always working on all cylinders. But the one that is the most tragic, and that I think is lends a tragic dimension to that 1980 election, is that Carter had something called the Council on Environmental Quality. And they would make recommendations in the White House on what he should do on the environment. And he would almost always, after studying them, because he studied the science, he would, other presidents were playing golf, he was reading scientific journals. He would adopt their recommendations and issue executive orders or introduce legislation, which with a Democratic Congress almost always passed. So in late 1980, the Council of Environmental Quality is preparing this report. It's part of something called Global 2000, and it's all about what was at that time called carbon pollution. And the remedies for carbon pollution, which we soon were calling global warming and then climate change, and at that time was talked about within the scientific community. On page A13 of the New York Times in early 1981, it says that these recommendations, which the president has adopted, the targets are exactly what the Paris Climate Agreement was in 2015. So we could have had a 35-year head start on confronting this problem if Carter had been reelected. Now, would he have, wrenched the United States away from fossil fuels? No. His first priority, and the reason that he pushed so hard for solar and got the first funding for green energy, was energy independence, so that the Arabs didn't have us over a barrel anymore. And he actually, was a pro-coal president. So that was his first priority. But because he is a man of science, he definitely would have dramatically accelerated research on climate change and begun to take other steps. He already introduced the first fuel economy standards for automobiles, and his plan was for hybrids by the middle 1980s. So just think about where we would have been if we had, adopted some of those far-reaching ideas that Carter proposed. But he got a lot of them started when he was president. The first toxic waste cleanup. They didn't even label the contents, the toxic contents, before the Carter administration. So, there were plenty of mistakes. There were policy miscues. There were things, as you mentioned, about his personality that made him less effective with Congress and the public than he could have been. But he didn't lie, and he looked to the future, and he was decent at his core, and that counts for something.
That's great. Thanks, John. Let me go to Brian Burke's got a question. What was Carter's reaction when you asked him about the failed hostage rescue?
He held up a finger and said, if we had had one more helicopter, because actually Carter and Brzezinski, they added 2 helicopters to the mission, but they had this terrible luck in the desert at a place called Desert One in Iran, and one of the helicopters turned back. Another one was disabled by engine failure, and so they had too many commandos, too many Rangers to fit on the remaining helicopters, and so Charlie Beckwith, the hard-charging colonel who was leading the mission, aborted. But then what happened is when one of the other helicopters took off, it crashed into a C-130, killing 8 servicemen. So the whole thing was just a complete fiasco. But he felt, I think wrongly, that if he had had another helicopter, they'd gone to Tehran, they would have gotten the hostages out safely, and he would have been reelected. I think what would have happened is they would have gotten to Tehran, and it would have been a bloodbath, and there would have been hostages killed, and some of them might have gotten out alive, but maybe not. And the whole mission was kind of a Rube Goldberg contraption. It was pretty ill-conceived in the Pentagon, and the failure led to some really important changes. The Goldwater-Nichols bill, which did so much to tamp down this inter-service rivalry that was crippling the Pentagon in those years. It came out of the fact that, the different services branches on that rescue mission they weren't talking to each other. And so Carter and I also talked about that a little bit. He's pretty philosophical, pretty mellow. I mean, he's this strange combination of, well, I asked one of his sons, what's the one word you would use to describe him? And he said, intense. And then other people feel like he's Zen-like. But he's many layered. He really does contain multitudes. And, I have focused recently on something that Stephen Colbert said about Trump. He said he's boring. And he's fundamentally boring because there's nothing new to learn about Donald Trump. We know exactly who he is. Carter is the opposite. At one point, I asked Carter by email, do you have anything in common with Trump? And he sent me back one word answer, no. They actually do. They were one-term presidents and they were outsiders. But, but Carter is really complicated that way. And those complexities kept me fascinated, and they offer a kind of an escape from the orange monster squatting in our brains, because not just because he's so much more decent, but because he's way more interesting and perplexing.
You mentioned his challenges in not managing the Kennedy relationship well, but I think more broadly, maybe this is sort of the Georgia state legislature myopia. More broadly, I think he paid a price for coming to Washington and not courting Tip O'Neill, not cultivating the House and the Senate, and to say these guys are natural allies, they're force multipliers, but they've got their opinions as well, and you better get them in your orbit. And it seemed to me that he just completely miscalculated that. It really got on the wrong side of his own core constituency.
That's basically true. I mean, not his entire core constituency. Black voters stayed completely loyal to him. But you're right that, he had this Georgia mafia. They come to Washington. They kind of disdain the Washington establishment. It doesn't take much to kiss up to my old boss, Katharine Graham, who was kind of the queen of Washington society. All you have to do is show up at her dinner parties. But the Carters didn't want to do that. What I and they
Yeah, and there was also sanctimony blended in with that. It was we're not going to do this because we're not part of the system and we're outsiders and we're sort of morally superior than you Washington type. So it was sort of denigrating them.
Yes, there was some of that, but they were denigrating him too. There was a lot
Sure.
of anti-Southern bias
Sure.
that you'd see in the press corps, and then the press corps. Jody Powell said, Carter's late press secretary said, we not only didn't get a honeymoon, we didn't get a one night stand. And it was true. Like Carter pardoned draft dodgers on his first day in office. And the Republicans just went to town on this. And he was facing a press corps that had helped bring him to the presidency out of Watergate. He would never have been elected if it wasn't for Watergate. And so the post-Watergate press corps, led by Hunter Thompson, who loved Carter. And one of the reasons I put the Andy Warhol of Carter on the cover of my book is that I wanted to show people that he was actually really cool before he was president. But then when he gets there, that same post-Watergate press corps just turns on him with a vengeance. And William Safire, affixes the suffix "gate" to every stupid flap in the Carter administration. And they made him seem like he was, crooked or something, which he was not. And so he didn't handle all that well. He canceled these water projects that were dear to the hearts of the old bull Democrats who ran Congress. But one of the things I found, Frank, is that take on him, which is really, it's not untrue, but it misses the larger picture, which is that things were much more bipartisan then, and he often got Republican votes.
Sure.
But even when he didn't get Republican votes, he had a Democratic Congress for 4 years, and Clinton and Obama were president for 8 years each, but they only had a full Democratic Congress for 2 years. So for 4 years, Carter was just ramming through bill after bill after bill, and the reporters would just yawn. Oh, another bill signing. I mean, what did Trump? He had maybe two or three major bill signings in 4 years. Carter had like 50, and major bills like that the press didn't pay any attention to. I remember asking one of the good reporters, do you know what PURPA was? No, I don't remember that. Public Utility Regulatory Act. And what it did was it allowed public utilities to use green energy, maybe just a little relevant to how we lead our lives now, So there were all of these things that were happening that because he did offend some people in the Democratic Congress, he never got credit for it. And everybody looked at, the 20% that he failed on, like he failed on taxes. He and Kennedy couldn't come to agreement on health care, welfare, kind of that sort of failed. And so they looked at his defeats and then, of course, what happened with the hostages and the rest, and just pocketed his victories.
We've got a lot of questions, so apologize. I've monopolized this conversation.
No, I'm talking too long. I'm babbling on too long.
But Vin Broderick asked, with George's prominence now in the middle of Black Lives Matters movement, could you talk about Carter's role in Georgia as a governor of the New South? Was the coalition he put together similar to those we see in the Democratic victories in the state now?
Actually, just the opposite. And this was part of the book that really interested me and where Carter did not cover himself in glory. So Carter's father was a white supremacist. His mother was a nurse who took care of black patients for free. And he was really raised by a third parent, a illiterate black farmhand named Rachel Clark. From the time he was very young, he was surprisingly enlightened on race. And at the Naval Academy, he defended the first black midshipman against hazing, and on board submarine, he defended his black crewmates. But then after his father dies in 1953, and he leaves Admiral Rickover's Navy, where he's engaged in the most exciting technological project of the middle part of the 20th century, the establishment of nuclear-powered submarines. They put a nuclear power plant on the back of a submarine before they put one on land to generate power. And there had been a nuclear accident, and he had to race through a melted down reactor in Canada, risking his life on behalf of Rickover, and other adventures, the amazing love letters that he wrote from sea to his wife Rosalind, which she gave me, and they're quite steamy love letters. So they have this life in the Navy that they really like. And then his father dies in 1953, and over Rosalind's objections, and she gave him silent treatment all the way back to Georgia, he returns home to Plains, and he takes over his father's business, an agricultural warehouse and farmland, and a lot of his commitments. But then Brown versus Board of Education happens, and Carter is in no position on the school board to implement Brown. And he ducks the movement, as I mentioned. And there's white terrorism in his county in Georgia. Martin Luther King described the sheriff there as the meanest man in the world, and others said he made Bull Connor seem like a nice guy. So this is the district that Carter is representing in the Georgia State Senate. And he is very careful. He's not a segregationist. He doesn't say anything racist, but he leads people to believe that he supports segregation because he doesn't raise his voice, doesn't speak out. And then when he runs for governor the second time, after a period where he's gone as a door-to-door missionary and had other adventures, he runs a dog whistle campaign. Very much like a lot of Republican campaigns in the South in recent years, where he embraces George Wallace, who was governor of neighboring Alabama, and he runs to the right of the former governor he was running against, Carl Sanders. He even pays a call on the founder of the White Citizens Council in Georgia just before the election to signal to the rural cracker vote that he's with them. His opponent had the African-American vote and the moderates and few liberals in Atlanta. And Carter, with that rural vote that is now overwhelmingly Republican, that's how he was elected governor, with that vote. But then something really interesting happens. On the last day of his campaign, he's being flown around the state by this eccentric Jewish pilot and entrepreneur who's also his biggest donor, who has been close to the King family and has introduced Carter to Daddy King during the campaign. Carter never bothered to meet Martin Luther King because if word had gotten back to his district that he was meeting with King, he would have lost his seat in the Georgia State Senate. So he didn't contact Dr. King at all, but he establishes a good relationship with Daddy King. And then this pilot is asked by Carter, you've done all this for me. What can I do for you? And the pilot takes out a flight map, and he has just a pencil, and he writes on the flight map. He doesn't have any paper. The time for racial discrimination is over. And he says, say it in your inaugural address. Sign it and say it. And Carter does in his inaugural address as governor of Georgia. And the white supporters there feel betrayed. And the black Georgians who were at the inauguration go, he said, what? They couldn't believe it. And he ends up on the cover of Time magazine as the face of the New South. And he makes good on what he said in his inaugural. He integrates Georgia state government. He puts up Dr. King's portrait in the state capitol and does a lot of other things on civil rights. So by the time he runs for president, he has that new Georgia Democratic coalition, moderate suburbanites and African American voters. And that's how he gets elected president. But he didn't do that in Georgia. He couldn't even run for re-election as governor under Georgia state law. He wasn't allowed to succeed himself. But he told me that if he had, he would have lost because he had alienated all these rural areas. So he completely, he was running a campaign that Republicans would run nowadays when he was first elected.
We got it. I want to try through these. So if you
Yeah,
don't
let
mind,
me
'cause
answer.
it's great.
Sure. Yeah.
So one question on North Korea. What do you make of Carter's, this is new to me, unilateral negotiations with Kim Il-sung? Well, Clinton's foreign policy team was plotting a different course. So this is post presidency that
Yeah,
Carter has his dalliance in North Korea.
I deal with all this. So Carter, mostly through Al Gore's efforts, is sent to meet with Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea. And he exceeds his mandate from Clinton. And Clinton is really angry about it. And some of Clinton's people actually call Carter a prick for doing this. And Clinton feels he's kind of tied his hands because Carter has said that if the North Koreans stop their nuclear program, the U.S. will lift sanctions. And then to make matters worse, instead of coming back and reporting directly to Carter for the second time that year, he did the same thing after keeping peace in Haiti. There was almost a war in Haiti with the U.S. Just parked just offshore. Carter goes on CNN before he reports to the president. This is why I think his post-presidency is a little overrated, if his presidency is underrated, because he'd take these sort of ego, star turns. But here's the thing. The deal was a good one. And people like Don Oberdorfer, the really well-informed Washington Post correspondent, says that Carter prevented a war on the Korean Peninsula. And a lot of the South Koreans believe that too. But then Kim died just shortly after Carter cut that deal. So it kicked off these negotiations. The U.S. and North Korea actually struck an agreement. People can argue over which side abrogated the agreement. When I looked into it, the answer was both sides did. But I think this idea that, if Carter hadn't mucked around on that issue, that the Clinton administration would have bombed North Korea's program, and that would have been the end of the North Korean nuclear threat. Talk about naive. I mean, they just would have rebuilt it, and so Carter bought the world some time, and he did a lot of important work in turning down the temperature on the Korean Peninsula.
Good. Okay, we're switching to the 76 Democratic primaries. Give us a 2-minute summary. How did this guy thread through a pack of a lot of talent? And how did this guy with no base, no national constituency, his only message is that he's sort of the outside the system, he's pristine is his only message. But how did that guy thread through the pack? And let me ask you too, were you voting in 76, and for whom did you vote?
I voted for Mo Udall. But because he was more liberal than Carter. It's a miraculous story. He was at 0% in the polls. He had the right message. It was very similar to Joe Biden's message after Trump. His message after Nixon, and Ford was then president, was, I won't lie to you. We need a government as good as its people. I will heal this country. And that was very powerful. And then people started to recognize that he was smart. He gave this speech on criminal justice that Hunter Thompson is at the speech that Carter's giving it. Before Carter gets up, Ted Kennedy and the other speakers were boring Gonzo Hunter Thompson, and he'd go out to his car and refresh his iced tea with Wild Turkey, go out to his car again, more Wild Turkey. Then Carter gets up and he starts attacking the criminal justice system of Georgia and racial injustice and quoting Bob Dylan lyrics. And this time Hunter goes to his car, he gets his tape recorder, and it's called the Law Day speech. And he played it for he didn't, unfortunately, I never heard him play it, but all these young reporters, I was too young, they have this guy who they revere, Dr. Hunter Thompson of Rolling Stone. And he's saying, this obscure peanut farmer, he's the guy. And I think this was hugely influential in getting the press corps to take him seriously. Then he realizes that the Iowa caucuses are the way to win. He was the first person who realized that you could get a fast start. And so the other candidates are much better known senators. They're in office. Carter is out of office. He's unemployed. He can spend a huge number of days in Iowa and New Hampshire. And he was brilliant at retail politics. And then, he has some challenges. The big moment for him was beating George Wallace in the Florida primary, and that set him on the path to the nomination. And then he almost blew the election to Ford because you worked for, Jim Baker, was such a brilliant campaign manager that they closed a huge gap and almost won the general election that year.
Yeah. No, it's a hell of a story. It's sort of, the impolite way of saying it is, look, the idea of Jimmy Carter in some ways is more appealing than the reality of Jimmy Carter. But Jimmy Carter as an outsider, as a breath of fresh air, as the honest guy, as the solo person against the machine, anti-establishment, is very appealing. So sort of an abstract.
That was him at his peak, although
yeah,
people think of him as being unpopular the whole time he was president. Like, oh, he had that goofy, cardigan sweater. That speech went over really well. In 1977, he went as high as 73%, 30 points higher than Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But he also, the next year, 2 years later, in 79, he goes down to 26%, where Nixon was when he resigned. So things were way more fluid in those days in terms of a president's popularity.
Yeah. Bill Kavanaugh's got a question. Do you think Carter's moralistic manner and emphasizing a lack of community, the way he teed up dealing with economic and energy change, is the reason he didn't get Americans back to his energy plan, taxes on fuel? And did he consider a different, more Reagan-like appeal to patriotism to justify energy savings? And I just want to play referee here. We're in our final few minutes, John. And what I want to ask all you to do is to bring that book from your bookshelf and bring it up close so people can look at that, because everybody on this call ought to buy a copy of this book. And I'll tell you something, this is the kind of book you want to give as a gift to anybody of our generation. You're looking for Christmas presents or whatever. It's a lovely, evocative of the 1970s and that general era. So please get John's book. He gets $1.50 each copy sold.
Here's the Andy Warhol. No, I
right.
don't.
So, but please go to Bill's question. And I apologize. We have one or two other questions. I apologize. We're going to have to forego those.
I'm going to go through all three of those really fast.
Okay, good.
Okay, so Bill's question is about the sanctimony, I guess, or should he have asked for more appeals to patriotism? He actually did in the famous Malaise speech, where he never used the word Malaise. It was all an appeal to patriotism and sacrifice. The problem is it's a nation of shoppers. We didn't want to sacrifice. So Reagan appealed to patriotism, but he didn't actually ask anything of the American people. Carter, by asking for sacrifice, hurt himself, although that speech also was well received at first until he made the terrible mistake of firing half his cabinet right afterward, which sent him right back down in the polls.
Okay, then the next speech is, next question is, can you give an opinion on the Carter Center election observation program?
So they've monitored elections in 115 countries, I think, at this point, and this year was the first time they've done it in the United States for reasons that relate to the fact that we don't have a national election commission, and they require that in order to supervise elections. But there were, one in particular really stands out, which I interviewed George H.W. Bush not long before he died about Jimmy Carter. And he was still sore at him for writing members of the UN Security Council and telling them that they shouldn't support the Gulf War. But he was very appreciative of Carter and very, very complimentary toward Carter in several other areas. And one of them was that when in 1990, Carter went down to supervise, to monitor the Nicaraguan election. And Daniel Ortega was running, the Marxist leader of that country, and he lost. And he didn't want to relinquish power. No communist had ever, since 1917, ever relinquished power after an election. And Carter stays up with him all night. And he says, I know how hard it is to lose. I lost. You can maybe make a comeback, which Ortega did. And so unlike Trump, Ortega said, okay, I'll respect the will of the people, and I'll make a comeback. And he got a couple of other concessions. So, that just shows that there were these other accomplishments that he was able to make after he left office.
Okay, and the final question is what do you think of the distractions that Brother Billy created, or family foibles, Billy Beer, and so forth?
I'm really glad you asked about that, because
This is Brian Burke again.
okay. So I have a number of Billy beer cans. Billy did not actually like the beer. He would pour the contents into the toilet and fill it up with vodka and then go out and put more beer. And Billy, it ended badly for him. He became a terrible alcoholic, and he died at 51 of pancreatic cancer, as did Jimmy's father and two sisters. He's the only one in his immediate family, other than his mother, who didn't get pancreatic cancer. But Billy had many great lines, and the one that maybe we can end with was when Carter was launching his presidential campaign. And even in Atlanta, they were saying in the papers, Jimmy Carter is running for president of what? Like, people thought it was ridiculous. And Billy said, I have one sister who's a holy roller. That's his sister Ruth, who was a kind of new age evangelist. Yeah. He said, I got another sister who rides with the Hells Angels. That was Gloria, who on her tombstone, it says, she rides in Harley Heaven now. She was the den mother of the Hells Angels, and she had a huge tattoo on her back of Tweety Bird pushing a lawnmower. That was Gloria Carter. And he said, and my mother went into the Peace Corps when she was 68 years old. That's Lillian Carter, who was on Johnny Carson a lot during the Carter years. He said, and my brother thinks he's going to be president of the United States. I'm the only normal one in this family.
That's a great line. That's a great line. Good.
So, but it is a colorful story, and I try to keep it moving along so it's not too policy heavy or too analytical for people as they take a break from whatever they're binging on.
John, you were fantastic to spend so much time with us, give us a great hour, and share your insights. How many years did you work on this book?
About 5.5 years, but I was also working on that documentary in the same period.
Sure.
And doing
no, but I mean, it's reflecting your point of you've made that he's multi-layered. I think you need multiple iterations, multiple interactions, multiple points of view to fully absorb sort of the complexities of a person like Carter. And I think you shared a lot of that insight with us today. So thank you for that time. Get that book. Everybody get the book. Help John out. And you'll enjoy it. You'll learn something as well. So thank you very much. And thank you to PA for hosting this. And thank you to everybody with us today who joined in. Sorry we couldn't greet everybody personally, but at some point we will have that darn reunion, and we'll get to have a beer together again.
Can I just say one other thing? If people want an inscription, just send me a letter with who you want it inscribed to, and I will send you back a book plate where, to Uncle Fred, whatever. And my address is 73 Upper Mountain Avenue, Montclair, New Jersey, which is where my roommate upper year, Jay Finney, was from, 07042. 73 Upper Mountain Avenue, Montclair, New Jersey, 07042. And I would like nothing more than to inscribe books to your holiday list.
Super, excellent. So send it to John and return postage, please. And he'll give you, or he'll just get your book plate.
Yeah,
just
you don't
ask him
even
and he'll
have
send you the book.
you don't have
Yeah,
to
that's right.
send any postage. I'll just
Don't send him the book. That's right. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying.
yeah, don't send the book. Just send me. You can actually, you know what? I'll make it easier for you. Email me. Then you don't even have to write me. Just email me with your address and who you want the book
That's great.
inscribed to at jalter@jonathanalter.com.
That's great.
And then I will send you back a book plate and you can stick
That's
it.
great. That's very gracious of you. Very kind of you, John. That's terrific. I hope people take advantage of that very kind offer. And Judy, we have to thank you for running this show as well. Judy Davis, thanks so much. And Phil, you were the host and set the whole thing up. So Phil, thanks for your good service on this. And I think that, Judy, does that conclude our show for today?
We are good to go. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Phil, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Really
Thanks.
appreciate it.
Bye-bye.